Hi, and welcome to Open, the show that opens the Bronx and the rest of the world to you. I'm Kibin Alleyne, and today we'll update you on what's happening in and around our borough. Coming up, a recent survey by Bankrate revealed that most Americans have a negative outlook towards tipping for services. A senior industry analyst at Bankrate tells us more about their finding. Why do Americans view tipping in such a negative way? Then, Network for Teaching Entrepreneurship is a global educational nonprofit focused on bringing the power of entrepreneurship to youth in low-income communities. The CEO of NFTE sits down with me to discuss their efforts to help teach kids. What can we do as a society to boost social mobility and make our capitalistic society more inclusive? After that, the organization FloodNet aims to educate communities with information on street flooding and how it impacts their neighborhoods. The Community Engagement Manager for FloodNet NYC shares more later on. What are some common ways flooding can occur in the city? And finally, the total number of child fatalities in NYC due to car-related deaths was brought to 101 in the Vision Zero era. Organizers are now saying New York City must prioritize redesigning its streets with child safety in mind. The Bronx and Uptown Organizer for Transportation Alternatives shares more on their efforts to protect our kids. What are some of the actions that the city could take to address the changing nature of vehicle traffic? So stay tuned to all this and much more is headed your way because we're now officially open. Hello, everyone. I'm Kibin Alleyne, and today is Tuesday, August 15th. You are now watching Open, a program that brings the Bronx and New York City straight to you. Don't forget to stay connected with us via social media at BronxNet TV. A recent survey by Bankrate revealed that most Americans have a negative outlook toward tipping for services. The survey found that 66% of the U.S. adults dislike tipping and feel businesses should pay their employees better instead of relying on tips. Senior industry analyst at Bankrate, Ted Rossman, now joins me to further discuss the finding of the survey on tipping in America. Ted, thank you so much for joining me.
Of course, yeah, thanks for having me.
Now, can you first just tell us a little bit more about your organization, Bankrate?
Bankrate is a personal finance website. We like to talk about helping people throughout life's financial journey. So that could include saving more, investing, paying down debt, picking the right credit card, all that good stuff.
Now, what inspired the survey your organization led that focuses on tipping?
We think this is an interesting topic, and it's one that we've tracked for several years now. I feel like a lot's changing with tipping. As we've moved on from the pandemic, that's changed some tipping behaviors and attitudes. I think that technology is really changing the nature of tipping. We're seeing these tip prompts popping up everywhere, whether it's on the screen at the coffee shop or at a food truck or other scenarios. So we thought this was an interesting financial topic to dive a little deeper and figure out what people think and how they're behaving.
Now, I kind of want to expand a little bit. You mentioned how the pandemic may have, impacted this, and I'm curious to know what ways, did you see that happening, especially since during the pandemic, we weren't even allowed to kind of use some of these services. So, why do you think there was a shift?
Early in the pandemic, tipping increased, and there was this groundswell of appreciation for service industry workers. And even when most dining rooms were closed, people were tipping generously for takeout and food delivery. And I feel like that groundswell of enthusiasm has definitely faded. Right now, we're seeing a lot of tip fatigue. And I think there are also some pandemic effects in the context of high inflation, which is partly a result of pandemic factors. And I think that's contributed to the dampening enthusiasm for tipping. I think businesses are under a lot of cost pressure and they're looking to offload a lot of these costs onto the customer. And I think tipping has become this kind of hidden surcharge. I mean, we're seeing it at coffee shops, food trucks. I encountered a tip prompt at a pick your own strawberry farm upstate recently. I encountered a tip prompt at a self-checkout at Newark Airport. I mean, I feel like some of these are really going too far.
I could agree. I think that one time I went to like a sandwich store and there was a tip prompt, and I'm like, you guys never had this before. So, I could definitely see the frustration. And as I mentioned, about 66% of the US adults have a negative view of tipping. Could you just tell us a little bit more about that finding?
Yeah, to go a little deeper on that, we found about 4 in 10 think that businesses should pay their staff better rather than relying so much on tips. I think that is well intentioned, but a little bit of be careful what you wish for, because when the rubber meets the road, we don't really want to pay higher prices. The famous restaurateur Danny Meyer was a good example with his Union Square hospitality group. A few years ago, they tried to do away with tipping and raise prices by about 20% to compensate. The feeling being that that would be more fair and equitable. It didn't really work out. A lot of people couldn't see past the higher prices. Even a lot of staff felt like they could make more at the restaurant down the street. But that's the biggest complaint, is that businesses should just pay their staff better. We also found about 3 in 10 are annoyed by those pre-entered tip prompts. And a similar number, again, about 3 in 10, think that tipping culture has just gotten out of control.
Now, you mentioned that people thought about possibly just paying the workers, or not necessarily paying the workers. I think it's different from making things a little bit more expensive. Although 16% of Americans say that they are willing to pay higher prices, you're saying that doesn't always work out. Can you just expand on that a little bit more?
We see a lot of this with young adults where by far Gen Zers are the worst tippers, millennials are the second worst. I think those two groups often have this kind of social justice angle, which is tipping is not fair. And, they're not wrong. There are unfortunately some ugly sides to tipping. Sometimes it can be racist, it can be sexist, it can be prejudiced. A hardworking server could be stiffed by some stingy diners. So, there is not a perfect system here. But that said, it is kind of the lay of the land right now. And I think if you're not tipping well, you're really hurting that individual worker, not the business. But I do think it's really notable that young adults are tipping the least often. I think some of it is that they have less money. But for instance, only about a third of Gen Zers always tip at a sit down restaurant. Only about half of millennials always tip, whereas it's about 80% of Gen Xers and baby boomers. So there are definitely some changing attitudes here. This is where I say, though, when push comes to shove, people say they want to pay more in lieu of tipping, but that hasn't really worked out in the real world.
Now, I also want to talk about employers and the idea of tipping. I think a lot of people are under the impression that, as we mentioned, that they should just pay their employees better. Have employers used tipping as an alternative to pay their employees better, or is that just a misconception?
I do think that tipping has become this kind of hidden surcharge. I mean, sometimes it is just a blatant revenue grab, like that strawberry farm I mentioned, or the self checkout at the airport, or some people are even being asked to tip at the doctor's office, or that online travel agency Hopper. They ask for tips when you book a flight or hotel. I mean, these are all very unconventional tipping examples that I think are very different from where we should be tipping. Like, we should tip ideally 20% at a sit down restaurant, and we should tip for food delivery and getting our hair cut and taking a taxi or ride share. I think it's some of these new examples that are sort of giving tipping a bad name. The thing is, though, as much as people complain about these pre-entered screens when the cashier flips that tablet around and it's kind of awkward because they're looking at you and how much do you want to tip? And I don't know if I wanted to tip at all, but now it's awkward. Starbucks debuted this functionality late last year, and they say about half of their customers are tipping. So it shows that as much as people grumble, the concept does work. And I think that's part of what's fueling this. And I feel like companies and customers are price sensitive with high inflation. And I think tipping's being viewed as this kind of hidden tax where it's a way to raise prices without actually raising prices.
Now, I know there's also been a lot of controversy around tipping because people are not sure whether the person they're tipping is actually seeing those tips or getting all of it. Can you just explain to us like what actually happens, whether it's at a restaurant or, if you tip someone who deliver your food, do they actually see all of those tips, or does some of it actually go to the organization?
By law, a tip should go to the worker. That said, sometimes it gets a little murky. when you're tipping the self-checkout machine at the airport, who actually gets that? The company behind that actually says that they distribute it to the workers who stock the shelves and play more of a security guard kind of role. But sometimes it's very murky. Sometimes tipping is not directly a tip. Sometimes it's more of a surcharge or a delivery fee, or it kind of depends how it's phrased. And sometimes there can be unintended consequences to that, because that's another competing trend where a lot of businesses are tacking on surcharges. We saw it during the pandemic. We've seen it with things like health insurance. Sometimes we see these inflation surcharges now. And if it's a surcharge or a delivery fee, there's a good chance that's going to the company. But I think a lot of customers think that's a tip. There have been some examples with some of the delivery companies, for example, where people are not tipping because they think the delivery fee goes to the worker, but it often doesn't.
Now, what are some thoughts, or how do thoughts differ on tipping based on the service? So whether you go to a restaurant or maybe you get a haircut, there are some things that I didn't even know were asking for tips. So can you just talk about some of those and how thoughts differ based on what it is?
We've asked for several years now about the most common tipped occupations, and sit down restaurants are still number one, but we've seen a pretty significant change there. So back 4 or 5 years ago, about 3/4 of diners were always tipping. Even that seemed a little low, but compare that to nowadays where it's only about 6 in 10 are always tipping. It's considerably lower than that among young adults. Like only about a third of Gen Zers are always tipping at a sit down restaurant. So that's moving in the wrong direction. But other things are the same way. Getting your hair cut, getting food delivered, only about half of people always tip in those scenarios. And that too has declined over the past few years. Only about 4 in 10 always tip when they take a taxi or ride share. Those are 4 examples that I think should be pretty universal. The ones that I find more optional are the quick counter service, takeout, coffee shop kind of example. That to me doesn't always require a tip. But I think it's interesting how the old fashioned tip jar, where you had to go out of your way to drop money into the jar, has been replaced by this awkward automated prompt. And we see it in apps as well with rideshare and other things. Those have been proven to work, but I think a lot of customers feel negatively about them.
Now we have about 2 minutes left. Can you just let everybody know what are some guidelines when deciding how much to tip, just so they're not confused or caught off guard?
I think we should always be tipping for sit down restaurant service. I think 20% is really the expected tip there. I think 20% is the norm also for getting your hair cut or getting food delivered, taking a taxi or ride share. Maybe with those food delivery and taxi and rideshare examples, maybe you can go a little bit lower, maybe more like 15%. The food delivery one's interesting though, because I wouldn't go lower than about $5, just because, let's say you're getting a $10 burrito or something delivered. I mean, a 20% tip is just $2. That doesn't stretch that far these days, especially with gas prices being high and the cost of living being so high. So I would kind of view $5 as a minimum. There was actually an interesting example this summer where I think it was in Texas, but a DoorDash delivery guy showed up and the customer tipped $5 on a $20 order. And he was saying, well, gosh, it's a nice house for a $5 tip. That really went viral. I actually thought in that case, $5, I think it was for a pizza. It amounted to a 25% tip. I actually think that was fine, but it really made the rounds on social media. I think it shows a lot of the deep, passionate feelings that a lot of people have about this. And I think it shows that a lot of service industry workers are under pressure because the cost of living is high and a lot of these wages have not kept pace, and they're looking to customers to tip to make up the difference.
Well, Ted, I want to thank you so much for joining us and having this conversation. It was really interesting just because it's something that everybody kind of encounters at some point. So thank you so much for having this conversation with me.
Yes, thank you for having me. I enjoyed it.
If you would like to read about Bankrate survey, please go to the link below. Don't go away. We'll be back with more Open right after this.
Is it time yet?
It's time.
Come start time for dinner.
Oh, terrific.
Donating pet food is one of the many ways you can help families in your community. Pets and people belong together. Learn more at petsandpeopletogether.org.
Kids!
I don't want to talk about it.
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 Families don't have to talk about everything, but they should talk about how to plan for an emergency.
Kids, you all right?
This family's prepared. Get tips and resources to make your family's emergency plan. Go to nyc.gov/readyny or call 311 for more information.
Welcome back. Network for Teaching Entrepreneurship is a global educational nonprofit focused on bringing the power of entrepreneurship to youth in low-income communities. NFTE's rigorous programs are taught by a highly trained teacher corps, and NFTE students are supported by a diverse volunteer corps drawn from the local community, including businesses, leaders, and entrepreneurs. Joining me now to discuss NFTE's efforts is the CEO of Network for Teaching Entrepreneurship, Dr. J.D. LaRock. Thank you so much for joining us.
Great to be with you.
Now, can you just tell us a little bit more about your organization and the work that you do?
Well, the first thing I want to say is that NFTE, the Network for Teaching Entrepreneurship, is Bronx born. We were established in 1987 by Steve Mariotti, who at the time was a school teacher at Jane Addams High School. And he noticed that his students were not always engaged in traditional classroom instruction, but yet they were very talented, they were very ambitious, and a lot of them wanted to start businesses. A lot of them needed money. So he piloted an entrepreneurship education program. Fast forward 36 years later, we are in 24 countries around the world. We are in 30 states in the US. We're serving more than 50,000 students each and every year through school-based programs, largely in underserved communities, just like you described. Our mission remains the same, to bring the power of inclusive capitalism to low-income communities and to build the next generation of diverse entrepreneurs.
Now, I'm so excited. I'm happy that you said that I was born in the Bronx, because I think that's amazing. We don't necessarily always hear about things like this, stemming from the Bronx, or, people often don't think that, people in the Bronx have these types of dreams. Can you just explain, why that was so important to kind of also just let everybody know, like, this is something that's from the Bronx and it was made for, people in areas like the Bronx?
Well, your viewers in the Bronx won't be surprised to hear this. People who are Bronx born, people from immigrant communities, people who were born in other places, they have some of this largest entrepreneurial drive and spirit of anybody, anywhere. What they're often lacking is access to the tools of inclusive capitalism. And so this is what NFTE was set up to provide. The drive, the ambition, the ideas, people have that naturally oftentimes. What they don't have is the how. And so NFTE provides the how. We go into schools, we train teachers to deliver our program. We bring in community and corporate volunteers from companies like EY and PayPal, MasterCard, and Microsoft, who support the learners and who support the teachers. And then we teach students how to create a business plan. And it all culminates in a Shark Tank style competition where students actually win real money to grow their businesses.
That is very cool. I really like Shark Tank, and I always tell people that, like, oh, I feel like I have business ideas. So, it's really exciting to hear that. Can you just explain how it feels that your organization is highly recognized? I understand your evidence-based model leverages an award-winning curriculum. You have highly trained teachers. And this all just sounds like such an amazing accomplishment. So, how does it feel to be a part of something like that, and that it's recognized widely?
It feels great. I mean, our country is founded on the ideas of opportunity and social mobility and equality, but we know that oftentimes those ideals don't get lived out in practice. And so it feels really great to be part of an organization made up of actually current and former educators like me. I'm a former educator who really care about bringing those tools and those values to the work that we do. And I'm very proud to say that companies you will know of were founded by entrepreneurs from the Bronx, entrepreneurs from Brooklyn, entrepreneurs from Oakland, entrepreneurs from Dallas. They started out as regular people, but now they're big CEOs with billion-dollar companies under their name, or small business owners who have made a career and a life for themselves and their families.
Now, something that I think is very interesting is that usually when we have these conversations about entrepreneurship or, starting a business, we're usually focused on adults. Why did you want to reach out to the youth? And why is it important to start young?
Well, first of all, I think you need to start young because building a business is hard. Being an entrepreneur is really hard. And so what you first have to do is build the entrepreneurial mindset. And that's what NFTE programs seek to do. Yes, we're taking students through the journey of identifying an idea and building that up into a business plan. But we're also teaching them skills like collaboration, communication, presentation skills, financial literacy skills. You need those in order to launch a business. Also, the ability to manage risk, because having a business requires you to manage risk. Opportunity recognition, because building a business requires you to see an opportunity and see that that could be something you could make a business out of. So in addition to the functional things that we're doing, we're also working with learners to build those skills and mindsets. And then when you start early and you repeat the process, you can actually create big success in driving an actual community of entrepreneurs. Our alumni data show that students who have been through our program, about 25% of them wind up pursuing entrepreneurship as a career for life.
That's amazing. Now, can you just talk a little bit, how do you teach someone, especially someone so young, how to have that entrepreneurial mindset? What's your education policy, or just, what is the groundwork for kind of putting that information into people who are so young?
Well, we start out with an assessment, which is kind of a fun thing. It's kind of like a personality archetype, and you take it and it shows you what your top 3 entrepreneurial mindset domains are. So it might be communication and future orientation and creativity. And that's a starting point, a great starting point for a lot of our students, because oftentimes they'll take this assessment and they didn't even know that they were the creative type, but this assessment is telling them that they are. The fun thing about the assessment is also matches you up to entrepreneurs in real life. So Oprah or Magic Johnson or Elon Musk or whoever. And so, of course, people look up to celebrity entrepreneurs in our culture. And we often light the spark when students take this assessment and they're like, oh, you're telling me I'm like Oprah? I share those same qualities? All right, maybe I'll keep going with this thing. So that's one of the ways we start.
That's amazing. That actually sounds like a lot of fun. I'm like, I kind of want to do something like that. It just seems cool. And I can imagine it inspires people to see, like people that they're already familiar with and how they may resemble or have some of the same qualities as them. So I think that's amazing. I do want to talk about COVID. Obviously, it affected so many young people, especially in their schooling, and how they learn and, how they were educated. How did that maybe affect some of the work that you did in working with these children?
Like everybody else, we had to bring our programs online. And we were really fortunate in that prior to COVID hitting, we already had a lot of our curriculum available online, so we didn't have to scramble. Nonetheless, we had to support our teachers in the ways that, of course, they were needed to be supported in delivering math and reading and all the other stuff that they're teaching. I'll say this, our corporate volunteers played a huge role during the COVID period. They were Zooming in from home, doing their support sessions, their mentoring sessions. We actually were able to dramatically increase volunteer and mentorship support to our NFTE students and our NFTE classrooms through COVID, because now volunteers didn't have to travel to the school to be in touch with the kids and the teachers. They could do it via Zoom or via Microsoft Teams, and they did that. Now that we're back from COVID, we're doing it in both ways. And so that's one silver lining in the cloud of COVID.
Now, I also want to expand on that. We saw that COVID, there was a dramatic increase and people who wanted to work, people who possibly couldn't work. Can you just talk about, how that kind of affected some of the work that you guys did in regard to maybe online classes? And did it also have an impact on the kids and their outlook on working as well?
Well, I'll tell you one way it impacted us as an organization. I told you we have a great team. So our team really wanted to do something for the world in light of the pandemic. And they knew that adults were being tossed out of their jobs, sectors were shutting down. So during the early days of the pandemic, we actually launched a program called NFTE Career Relaunch. We made it free to anybody throughout the world. And it was basically a self-guided course that allowed people who needed a job to be able to get a job by turning themselves into entrepreneurs. More than 10,000 people in the US and around the world took part in that free resource. And it was so successful, we actually decided to launch adult serving programs with community colleges and public four-year institutions and colleges as a result of that experiment during COVID.
And are those programs still available? Can you just talk about them a little bit more?
Yeah, they're still available. So we have a program that we use with colleges and universities called Start It Up. And it's basically the same idea as the programs we run in middle schools and high schools, except it's more geared toward adults. So it has some more advanced concepts, and it has more content around how you actually get financing for your business and the things you do, once you've actually launched the business.
Now, we have about a few minutes left. I just want to know, and I know this may be a loaded question, but, what can we do as a society to boost social mobility and make our capitalistic society just a little bit, or hopefully a lot more inclusive?
Yeah, it's a great question. The US is a capitalist democracy. And, NFTE is not an ideological organization. But I would say that, you can't have free enterprise and entrepreneurship without capitalism. And capitalism has done many good things for the world. The problem is it hasn't done good things for everybody, and there are certainly bad things about capitalism. So again, what we're trying to do is to take the positive side of capitalism and bring those tools into communities that haven't had access to them. I think the core issue with capitalism, as I see it, is not that it's a good system or a bad system. It's just not a system that's equally available to everybody. So I think the way that we make it more inclusive, the way we improve it, is to do just what we're doing, to really work hard and intently to make sure that students who would be excluded from those tools actually have access to them.
And I just want to talk about just the type of learning that probably goes on in the organization. Can you just explain, the difference between project-based learning versus experiential learning?
Yeah. Well, see, here's the secret sauce, I think, because students and teachers tell me all the time, we love NFTE. This is so much fun. It's like nothing else that we do in the school day. And the reason why is because unlike many other forms of learning, which are great, by the way, I'm not here to trash traditional learning, but I think the thing that makes entrepreneurship education really special for teachers and students is that you're starting with an idea that you came up with. You're starting with a problem in your family or your community that you want to solve. You're starting with a passion that you have. And so the student businesses that emanate from a very honest and authentic place for learners. That's one of the things that makes them want to keep going, even in the face of all the struggles that come along with building a business.
And I also want to add to that, just hearing the personality, assessment, it also gives them a chance to learn about themselves and not just learn about something that was already, put out for them to just listen to. It's something for them to grow and learn about themselves. So I can imagine that's why so many people like it. But I just want to thank you so much for joining us and having this conversation. I think it was amazing. And this is something that I wish I could do. So once again, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much. And if any of your viewers would like to find out more, they can go to our website, www.nfte.com. We'd love to work with even more schools in the Bronx and beyond.
Wonderful. So as mentioned, to learn more about the networking for teaching entrepreneurship, please go to their website at www.nifte.com. We have to take a quick break, but we'll be back with more Open right after this.
Dear moms and dads, what you have achieved here today is going to help us and our futures. It is why we are coming up on stage to collect your diplomas.
You know it's true.
Mom, we love you always.
Everything I do.
When you graduate, they graduate. Visit finishyourdiploma.org to find free and supportive adult education centers near you.
We all know what it's like to feel alone. But it just takes one new connection. Want to get out of here? To empower many.
This is unbelievable.
It doesn't take a superhero to bring forces together. We all have the power to reach out.
Let's go!
And help someone feel like they belong.
Pretty cool, huh?
We are stronger together.
One of the deadliest mass shootings in U.S. history at Post nightclub in Orlando. Walking into the building for the first time after the shooting, it was crippling, but it had to be preserved. If you're an ally of this community, speak out. There are more of us together than apart. It is the power of love in its rawest form.
Welcome back. As areas of New York continue to face flooding, the organization FloodNet aims to educate communities with information on street flooding and how it impacts neighborhoods that are vulnerable to high tides, storm surges, and storm water runoff. Community Engagement Manager for FloodNet NYC, Véronëque Ignace, joins me to discuss their efforts and what you can do to stay informed about flooding. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Now, I just want to talk about your organization a little bit more. Can you just tell us more about FloodNet and the work that you do to inform people about flooding?
For sure. FloodNet is a partnership that really started in 2020 and is happening between academic researchers at the New York University, NYU, and the City University of New York, CUNY, as well as some government partners that we have, which are the Mayor's Office of Climate and Environmental Justice, the New York City Office of Technology and Innovation, including the New York City Department of Environmental Protection. And really what this project is doing, our mission is to develop tools that can be used for real-time urban flood monitoring and implement those tools across New York City as well.
And can you just tell us a little bit more about like what some of those tools may look like or how, some of that may work?
Yeah, for sure. I think it's really interesting to talk about tools because so much of what we're developing can be used not just here in New York City, but in other places across the country. But what we're really doing is kind of trying to build at scale a network of flood sensors that can collect data in real time about when flooding is happening, how severe that flooding is, and really update the city, partners, residents, and folks with information from those sensors onto a data dashboard that we have available on our website.
Now, can you talk about some neighborhoods in the Bronx that are a little bit more prone to flooding? And I also want to add that, like, as a Bronxite, sometimes I think for a lot of people in the Bronx, we don't necessarily think of like flooding like in the city. Like normally we'll think about it in maybe upstate New York, but could you just talk about how it may actually be affecting some areas in the Bronx?
Yeah, for sure. I think first I would say that really resonates with me. I'm a New York City native as well, and we don't often think about flooding as something impacting us. But I think what we can consider is that flooding in New York City is happening in a couple of ways, right? Either the water is coming from the sky, where we're having high intensity rain events that are impacting us and causing flooding to occur, but also there's also flooding that's coming from the coast. So all of the neighborhoods that are in the Bronx that are right along the coast are going to be impacted by flooding. And really it's up to what our city can do in terms of being able to drain out that water as it's happening, which is what we call like stormwater piping systems, whether we are in a position to actually drain out that water and ensure that folks are safe.
Now, speaking of safe, do you have any possibly like some safety tips that Bronx residents should know, or maybe just New Yorkers in general, as we mentioned that we don't necessarily think of ourselves as people affected by this? What are some things they should know just to be safe in regard to that?
I think as far as the work of FloodNet is concerned, what we're really hoping to do is that folks are able to know what their resources are and where they can find them, right? The more informed you are before a flood event happens, the safer that you'll be, right? Not just about your daily decision making, but other ways that you can kind of be a source of information within your community. So New York City stormwater flood maps are really important resource for people to know. The New York City Office of Emergency Management as well has a bunch of resources available in various languages that folks can become familiar with as well. And I think on our end with FloodNet, what we're hoping to do, especially through community engagement, is ensure that folks are able to read and interpret the data that we're collecting and use that to their advantage.
Now, you briefly mentioned the, collaboration with CUNY. Can you talk about this collab with CUNY and NYU to create flood sensors to help monitor flooding?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting conversation because our partners that make up FloodNet are they're vast and they're diverse, and I think each of the partners as well have built longstanding relationships within the communities they serve, and on different types of projects related to this issue. So FloodNet really is just one project within a spectrum of other projects addressing flooding in the city. CUNY, on the CUNY side, we have the Science and Resilience Institute at Jamaica Bay, which is based out of Brooklyn College. And we have the Advanced Science Research Center, which is based in Harlem at the Graduate Center. Both of these partners were developing sensors. Then we have on the NYU side in there at the engineering school, what originally was the Flood Sense project that was also developing sensors. So I think the mayor's office, who knew about both of these endeavors happening, was able to communicate with them and suggest that they work together. And ultimately, that's what we're doing now.
Now, for those who are unaware, including myself, can you just explain what flood sensors are and how that actually works?
Yeah, it's definitely. So we are developing these flood sensor tools, and I think we're still kind of fine-tuning what the manufacturing of those sensors are so that they can kind of live at scale across the city. But it is a small device that works with a little bit of a solar panel on it, and it gets installed onto a U-channel post, which, to be honest, before this project, I did not know what that word was. But it is the guardrail that holds the parking signs that we see on the streets, the ones that tell us which side of the street to be on. So we install a small device right onto that, and it works with an ultrasonic sensor. So it sends a pulse down to the ground and measures the distance back up to be able to let us know whether water is there and how much of it is there. The sensor does look like a camera, but it is not a camera. And so some of our community engagement efforts are really trying to ensure that the folks that see it know what it is before it gets installed and have a say in where it goes and where we can start to collect that data.
That's a really cool thing. I'm so glad that you were able to explain that, especially the part where you say, like, we want the community to know, because I think oftentimes people see things and they're like, they feel like unsure or, like just not aware of what's going on. So I think that's amazing that you let the community kind of be involved in what happens in that. Can you just explain, is this like the only area where they can be involved, or there's more ways that they can be involved in what goes on in their community?
No, I think there are so many other ways to be involved in this project. And one of the core principles of this project is that not just that we are offering open data, access to data, but also open access to the technology, right? And part of that also means being able to collect and incorporate feedback from key stakeholders that are interested in this project, and that includes residents as well. So outside of just suggesting where a sensor can go and kind of informing us where they may have be experiencing flooding on the ground, there are also opportunities to facilitate educational workshops with us where we can either lead those or be invited to other activities and programming that is happening across the city to kind of spread this information and also share what we know about how to build sensors, about how the data dashboard works, and share resources that address flooding across the city.
Now, for our viewers watching, can you explain how to accurately read the data on flooding maps?
Well, I think flooding maps are just can be challenging for anyone, right, including myself. So as far as that goes, I think we are really interested in being a resource for folks to help teach how to interpret data and how to read those maps. And then I think it will also be really important to mention that the partners that make up FloodNet, especially those like the Community Flood Watch Project, which has been happening in Jamaica Bay, is another resource where our partners are actually doing the work in training folks about how to read these maps, how to know about forecasting, and how to also collect data, right? Taking photos of flooding, submitting it to tools that can be shared across the city.
Now, what are some common ways flooding can occur in the city, and are there different types of floods?
Yeah, I think I alluded to this, as I mentioned before, right? We are seeing flooding that's happening from high rain events. We're also seeing flooding that's coming from the coast, right? Where there are coastal events in the sea, the neighborhoods in the city that are living across the coast are being impacted by that water. But what can also happen too is what we call high tide flooding, right? Where the tides are actually rising and that water is coming inland as well.
Now, are there any specific flooding disasters that alter how the city handles a flood crisis?
I think overall it's just really important to see again that FloodNet is one project that is addressing flooding in the city on a spectrum of other projects. So the city is really doing its due diligence and trying to tackle this in multiple ways, where we know that to some extent our infrastructure is not responding well to flooding as it's happening. And we're seeing more of that going on. So I think there's a lot there to unpack, especially considering the fact that flooding is impacting neighborhoods across the city very differently, including in the Bronx. And so as far as the city is concerned, it's really important that residents and other stakeholders are also equally informed to be able to speak back to the city about their experiences and what they know.
Now, I also wanted to talk about just like some of the work that you hope to do in the Bronx. I know we got to speak previously,
right.
And you talked about like Longwood, an area in the Bronx could possibly be an area for outreach. Could you just talk about outreach efforts and, your goals for that?
Yeah, that's something I can definitely speak to. Right now, we have sensors that are installed in Soundview and the Foxhurst area. We're looking right now, I can say specifically in the Longwood area to build connections and contacts, but that's non-specific, right? I think across the Bronx, what we want to ensure is that our community engagement efforts are touching the outreach part, which I think is just like the tip of the iceberg as far as getting people to know who we are and what we're doing and being able to suggest to us where we should be looking and who else we should know in the city. But then there's the other component of community education, right? How do we share our knowledge? How do we share our resources and teach folks about how to use this dashboard, right? It's one thing to know the sensors is putting information there, but what do you do with it afterward? And then there's some part of it, which I alluded to as well, where folks can kind of be mobilized to take photos of what they're seeing and so long as it's safe, of course, and share that with statewide tools like MyCoast.
And I think this is amazing also because I think it encourages people in their community to be a little bit more involved, about like what's happening in their area as opposed to just like only looking at the news. Obviously, that's important to be informed, but I think this is a cool way to like get community members to be involved. So I think that's amazing. Can you just quickly let us know like just the importance of just kind of building that relationship as well?
Yeah, I think building it and maintaining it are equally important. And what we should know, especially for those of us that are New Yorkers, is that there is nothing like a community network, right? There is nothing like being able to share information with your neighborhoods. I think that we might also learn a lot of what's happening in the world just based off of that. And that's something that we want to leverage as far as community engagement goes for FloodNet, is really ensuring that folks know who we are and are able to facilitate a trust building, not just for folks to us, but also, us to the community as well.
Well, I want to thank you so much for joining us and having this conversation. So thank you.
Thank you so much.
We'll be right back with more Open right after this.
¿Qué color? Perfecto, mijo. Gracias. Thank you. What's wrong, mijo?
Donating to a pet's medical care is one of the many ways you can help families in your community. Pets and people belong together. Learn more at petsandpeopletogether.org.
Most hiring algorithms would scream me out.
Some bosses couldn't see me as a leader.
I've run this place for 20 years, but I still need to prove that I'm more than what you see on paper.
I've been running code as long as I've been able to reach a keyboard.
This is what I do. It's second nature for me, coordinating 100 details at once.
It's the way my mind works. I have a very mechanical brain.
I sold them on my skills.
You gotta be so good they can't ignore you.
My magic is
analytics and empathy. That's how I'm getting clients. You have to have the confidence in yourself to show up and defy the odds.
I am more than who I am on paper.
I never got a college degree. And today, I'm the CEO of my own company. People want to tell me I'm one in a million, when actually I'm one of millions. Stars are all around us. It's time for them to shine.
Where did the time go? I don't know how I got here. Ooh.
You've done the hard part. You quit smoking. Now do the easy part and get scanned for lung cancer.
If you smoked, you may still be at risk, but early detection could save your life. Talk to your doctor and learn more at savedbythescan.org.
Welcome back. In the first week of July, 2 children lost their lives due to vehicle accidents, bringing the total number of child fatalities to 101 in the Vision Zero era. This unfortunate occurrence led the organization Families for Safe Streets to release a report titled "Why New York Must Design Streets for Children," along with a website honoring every child who lost their life in traffic accidents. Organizers are now saying New York City must prioritize redesigning its streets with child safety in mind. Joining me to discuss this effort is Bronx and Uptown Organizer for Transportation Alternatives, Jada Yeboah. Jada, thank you so much for joining me.
Oh, thank you. I wish it was under happier circumstances, but
Right.
I am happy to be here as well.
Now, can you just provide some insight into the events that prompted the creation of the report, Why New York City Must Design Streets for Children?
So we've just been seeing a record level of children being not just killed, but like horribly maimed and just in terrible car accidents that specifically often are in communities of color, that we've noticed that the community, like that the governmental bodies that be just do not seem to pay attention. And this was a way to kind of put pressure on not just like the council members and the city board and the community boards, but also the mayor to respond to these, quite frankly, very horrifying incidents of like child mutilation and child like death that like we have been seeing again, specifically in mostly Black and brown communities. So this was a way to just at least put pressure to, you know, show the people of New York City what is actually happening, you know, give some kind of like a pressure push to have a conversation that leads to safer streets for children.
Now, for background information, can you just talk about Vision Zero era and what that actually is?
So it's complicated. In terms of trying to create safer streets, trying to like implement more busways and greenways to alleviate the pressure of the car resiliency in New York City, we're trying to kind of like move away from that, create a space where it's just a lot more pedestrian friendly and car unfriendly. I don't know if that's a term, but I will be using that for this this conversation. Car unfriendly is really how I try to think of Vision Zero, a way of moving New York City into an era in which, you know, there are just much more like choices and much more other kind of routes for pedestrian friendly modes of transportation.
Now, the report mentions the increase in the number of vehicles as a factor that has impacted the safety of children on New York City streets. Can you provide a detailed explanation of just the report in general?
Yeah, of course. So we're seeing more cars on the streets, and not just that, we're seeing an increase in the weights and of these cars. We're seeing about 60% of the new car registrations in New York City are SUVs and trucks. These are big cars. They're not little. I'm from North Carolina. Like I know what a truck is like, you know? And so a lot of times, like it is not just that we are seeing an increase in car prevalence and like car culture in New York City, but like in the conversation of, you know, safe streets for children, we're seeing heavier cars. And so these instances of like accidents are going to just be a lot more dangerous because like these cars are just a lot heavier. They weigh more. It's harder to like stop. It's harder to brake, you know, like there's more gas to them. So we are seeing cars that like not just more cars in general, but cars are not necessarily compatible for a New York City street. And so that is a big concern for a lot of like kind of like the main findings in the article is that, you know, we are seeing more cars, but the type of car we're seeing as well is very, very much like dangerous and counterproductive to creating like safe streets for children.
Now, I'm not sure if this was explored, but was there any view on like how possibly COVID or the pandemic has impacted this? Because I know that since a lot of people were afraid of like being in public, a lot more people were driving cars, especially with everything that was going on the subways. More people felt safer in cars. Did you see any like correlation between the two, or was that something that your organization looked at?
Yeah, see, I think that conversation is an equity conversation as well, because I think that like we live in a very individualistic world, and COVID was a big factor in that. You know, it was harder to like social distance in the subways. You know, it's harder to do a lot of these things, but it's not impossible. And I think that when we talk about creating safe, much more like accessible modes of transportation, when we speak about incidents on subways, a lot of times like those incidents are, you know, unhoused folks that are causing problems, or, not wanting to be around the poverty that exists in New York City. And I think a lot of times, like, that is the narrative that is used to push a very, very specific kind of like very isolating culture that not a lot of people can afford cars. You know what I mean? Most people in New York City do not utilize cars to get to where they needed to get to. So what about all those folks, And so like when we talk about COVID, I think it is important to also talk about how a lot of times that rhetoric of, social distancing, and this is not to say you shouldn't always social distance, of course, they're seeing an uptick, so got to do that. But like we also see how like a lot of times like these conversations are very much woven into this kind of like, oh, well, I don't want to be around those kind of people. Like it's just not safe. It's dirty. And I think dirty is a big thing that like I've heard a lot of times in that conversation. It's like, oh, the subway is dirty, or like the people are dirty. And a lot of times that's just code for like unhoused folks that you just don't want to be around, or certain kinds of like, certain kinds of people that you don't want to be around. I don't want to get into the conversation of like mental illness and like, creating space for that. But I do think a lot of times like that is a segue that it happens. And so it's like, no, it's easier to be in my car. And we have to talk about like the levels of privilege that occur just in that, like, that phrasing of like, well, I feel safer in the car. Well, why do you feel safer in the car? You know what I mean?
Right.
Why don't you feel safe on the subway?
I want to add to that, or I know you kind of mentioned it also, like how 65% of children were killed by larger vehicles. Can you just expand on, like why that was such an important thing to look at? And I think that like when people hear about a car crash, they're not normally thinking about the, the size of the car, but can you actually talk about like why, an SUV or a van or a truck, why that's important when we look at these unfortunate events?
Yeah, of course. I think I kind of mentioned it a little bit earlier in the sense of like these cars are like not super compatible for the city. So it's not just that, they take up more space. They're not great on gas. Like it's just a lot more emissions that happen with these cars. And on top of that, it's just when we talk about like transit equity, which is kind of like what TA does, there's a lot more to it than just cars. We talk about like infrastructure. We talk about climate resiliency. We talk about, safe streets for children. I think that like the emphasis on the SUVs kind of explore, and trucks, of course, explore all these kind of tenets of like, okay, it is bad for children because, it weighs more. When you hit a child, a small child, it's going to cause like a much more intense kind of and traumatic like impact. Second of all, they're not super like climate resilient. A lot of times these cars like need a lot of gas, produce a lot of emissions, and like they also just take up a lot of space on the parking like in parking spaces for like, bikers who may not be able to like be accessible for them because there's a huge truck like parked there. Like, and we can also talk about the fact that like, again, specifically in the Bronx, because I'm the Bronx Uptown Organizer, we don't see as many like protected bike lanes. We don't see those things. And so these cars are going to be parking where like bikes are going to be, where, scooters are going to be, where people are walking. And so a lot of times, like, it's just this, I think that like the weight of the car and the type of car is just very emblematic on just like a lot of the different kind of like intersectionalities and like that happen within the conversation on transit equity.
Now, as we mentioned, this was a part of a larger effort to get the city to kind of look at what's actually happening. What are some of the actions that New York City can actually take to address the changing nature of vehicle traffic?
Well, there's quite a few, but I'll only talk about 2 or 3. I don't want to bore y'all, but I think that like one thing would be, making safe streets for children, specifically like a child, I'm missing my words right now, but like building like school streets. So streets that are, because we see again, like most accidents that happen around schools happen on that 8 a.m. Marker, which is, a lot of times like the time that children are coming in. And so that's a lot more dangerous. A lot of times too, we see that 43% of accidents that happen around schools are going to be happening in Black and brown communities. And so there is a racial conversation to this as well. And so to do that, I think that like in the spirit of Vision Zero, we must like create much more like accessible paths for pedestrian friendly / car free zoning for children. So making sure that there is no cars around schools, like it is a school street. We can find other ways to get children in and out of school. There's busing, there's biking. A lot of the committee members that I know like bike with their children and whatnot. And like we can talk about the accessibility conversation and also in maybe like what is it called? What is that word? I'm forgetting it, but we'll move on from that. I think that like making streets safe for children in the sense of no car should be around those schools. We shouldn't see cars around where children are going to be like running around because they're kids. You know, I have a little brother, he's 7. Like he's not thinking about like, let me look and turn. Like they're just going to be running around. And so creating that safe space for them, and also universal daylighting. So universal daylighting would be basically like removing parking spots from intersections. Okay. Making sure, like kind of I was saying earlier, like a lot of times like these cars, like they park there and like not just parking there, but like driving into those intersections around schools specifically is a very dangerous kind of like thing that happens because like again these cars are huge. It's a lot more work to stop them, to break them. And
I do want to interject just really quickly because as we're talking about all of this, I think it's so important, and I definitely want to highlight that there is a memorial for so many kids who were affected by this, and I definitely want people to know about it. Can you just talk about the memorial and you know why that was so important to include along with some of the work that you guys are doing right now?
Yeah, of course. So this was a lot of the conversation that happened around, you know, Sammy's Law, and like I want to give a big like shout out to specifically NTA, the Families for Safe Streets branch, because like they have been doing so much like mental and like emotional work that goes into this. And I feel like this kind of memorial was like an outpouring of that, a way to just kind of like, because we do like there's a lot of data points, you know, there's a lot of like, yeah, like let's crunch the numbers and all these things, but we forget that this is a very human thing.
There's a lot of feeling involved with
and
this.
A lot of the people that are in the Families for Safe Streets have lost people. So this is like work that's kind of like igniting trauma that's already been there. And, you know, like, of course we have like, kind of like, along with like the memorial, we also have like a space for like families who have lost children, who have lost family members, to kind of come in and like speak and like have these kind of like therapeutic sessions, yoga sessions and whatnot. But I think that like a lot of that work was almost kind of like a defiance in a sense, like just an emotional kind of release that like needed to happen specifically because of like the kind of work that's happening and the kind of conversations that we are like engaging in. And so
can you just tell people how they can just look at the website and like actually see the memorial?
Yeah, of course. I'm actually forgetting the website, but
okay,
is transportation,
okay.
transalts.org/FSS, Families for Safe Streets. And it should be up there.
Okay, and we'll also have it on the screen so that people can look at it. But I want to thank you so much for joining us. This isn't like a easy conversation to have. And as you mentioned, there's a lot of numbers and everything that goes along with it. So thank you so much for joining us and having this conversation.
Yeah, no, of course. I just really wanted it to be like a real face to it, because I think that like in the report, again, it's numbers, it's like words, and like it's important to have that kind of like research to back up what you're doing. But I also think it is very important to like realize that like these are people, you know, these are children, and these are like children in our community. Like it is very often so that like we are like the communities, Black and brown folks are neglected, will not often be getting that kind of like, you know, that special treatment. And so we have to talk about like what equity and like what transit equity really means and how we can really engage with that properly. But I'm done talking. I'm so sorry.
It's okay. Thank you so much. If you would like to learn more about Transportation Alternatives efforts to help protect our kids, please go to projects.transalt.org/100children. We've come to the end of our show today. I'd like to thank all of our guests for joining us and you, the viewers, for tuning in. If you missed any part of today's show, you can catch the recable cast at 5 and 10 p.m. on Optimum Channel 67 and Verizon Files Channel 33, or watch anytime on the web at bronxnet.org. You can catch a brand new episode of Open with Darren Jaime on Wednesday and Rena Valentine on Friday. I'm Kibin Alleyne, wishing you and yours safety and wellness now and always. See you next time.